Now, why is a lawyer standing up here talking about this? I mean, the lawyer's just going to give you the negative answer. How can we do anything about the Federation? We can't amend the Constitution. I think the last successful amendment was about 50 years ago. And then the thing that people have been saying for the last few years, we've really got to get rid of the states, because frankly, they're just in the way of the federal government dealing directly with the councils, and I'm really intrigued by that model that Percy just put up there, and you might be able to have a much more direct interface between the federal government and the councils. So I used to think. But in fact, the more I've worked in infrastructure, the more I've realised the importance of the states and the role they play. And it's funny, the founders of the Constitution realised that as well. Of course, it was a negotiated document, and like all negotiated documents, you ended up with a camel. But nonetheless, it's been a very successful one for Australia. And I'm intrigued when I look at it from the point of view of infrastructure, which I haven't had to do before. And then if I factor in the comments both Stephen and Ian made about first look at the roles and responsibilities and then the funding, and I realise the first problem for me is solved. Because in terms of the role of the states, they actually are responsible for infrastructure. Our Constitution works on the basis that the federal government has certain articulated powers. Anything that's not in the Constitution falls back to the states. So in a sense, all the reserved powers that the Crown can do are the powers of the state. The only reason the federal government's role has expanded is because it's been quite successful in a few cases in the High Court. And it's really handy if you're trying to expand your power base and the arbiter of your power base is the person to whom you appoint judges. So you can actually manipulate the system, not that I say that that's happened, but you can actually run it in a way that expands your power base and you can expand the role of the federal government. And that has happened, whether unintentional or not. That is what's happened over the last 100 years. But if we come back to the role of the states, because of that reservation of powers to the states are actually responsible for the delivery of services. Schools, police stations, the court system, roads, rail, transport of other natures, so on. And yet, they're not the ones who have the ability to raise the funding to pay for it. So they've got this responsibility to deliver services, but they don't have the real means to actually fund the delivery of those services. Because you see, most services are delivered via infrastructure. Putting aside the virtual world of education these days, you need to have a road built to drive a car on it. You need to have a school built to conduct education. You need to have a hospital built to provide services in the health sector. And that all costs money. And if we start thinking about that, let's start thinking about, well, what is infrastructure? There's usually a definition that runs around, there's public and private infrastructure. Private infrastructure is the big mining boom we've had over the last 5 or 6 years. A lot of money going into, effectively, what are private investments in infrastructure. Then you have public infrastructure. And when we talk about public infrastructure, we usually talk about economic and social infrastructure. Economic infrastructure, roads, rail, power stations, airports, freight rail. Social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, prisons, police stations, courts, and the like. And the states need to invest in both of those to actually provide the services that they are obliged to provide under the way our Constitution is framed. But the problem with the states is every time they invest in something, the fruits of their investment largely go to the Commonwealth. Why is that? You see, when a state invests in something, typically it leads to an increase in economic activity. Who is the primary beneficiary of an increase in economic activity? The Commonwealth Government, either via income tax, capital gains tax. Local government gets a little tiny bit through rates, that's about it. State government gets a little bit through stamp duty, and if, hey, there's a boom in the housing market, they make a lot of money. But if there's not, they're not making money. They also make money through land tax and also a bit through payroll tax, and there's lots of arguments about whether their payroll tax in particular is a good tax or not. And then finally you have GST, which is actually collected through the states. So it's a state tax, if you like. But then the way it's distributed, to my mind, is quite unfair. And I know there are very difficult issues around that, and I think Ian touched on some of those in terms of the disparity in distributions to go back to, say, the Northern Territory compared to Western Australia. So having considered that background, we started looking at it, Bree and I, in our paper to see, well, why don't we look about trying to actually link the use of particular assets to the payment for those particular assets. Currently, for example, a lot of road funding comes through fuel excise. And one of the problems there is that a large percentage of the fuel excise collected doesn't in fact go back into roads. It disappears off into consolidated revenue and is used for other purposes. But experience around the world has shown that if you can persuade the community that an additional tax you're going to charge them will actually go back to the asset that they are using, they can make that connection. And there are examples around the world. LA County, they actually went to a vote in the community in the way Americans vote on everything. They went to a vote, and in that vote they said, we will accelerate a 20-year infrastructure plan into a much shorter time frame, but we want you to pay an additional loading on your sales tax. And they got a 75% vote in favour. The community can buy into that proposition. The community can understand that if you are prepared to link the funding with the use, they may see the benefit that comes from that because they're the ones who are actually using that asset. And that's one of the issues that we really need to come to grips with, in my view, having spent a long time in infrastructure and watched successive governments. I've advised 4 state governments and a number of federal governments about the challenges in funding infrastructure. And usually it just breaks down to an argument about should we borrow more, or should we try to get it off balance sheet, or should we do some other form of structure that enables us to deliver it. I would submit that it's just a matter of actually making the linkage of the use and the payment more real to the community, and then you can actually get support. And I think we've seen Ian Harper coming out and saying something similar to that. In his view, you should take away the various taxes associated with driving a car, for example, and come down to a user-based charging for roads. Now, there are quite a few challenges there, and you have to start small and take larger steps as you go along, and I think Ian touched on that before, but that's really what we're looking at in the way we've addressed this issue in the paper. I guess the second issue that comes out of it is, will this ever be implemented? And that's part of the problem we face, because I can see this research will produce lots of really good ideas, but implementation is the great challenge. And I can just say, for example, this idea of user charging for roads, Infrastructure Australia has referred to it, the Productivity Commission has referred to it, Infrastructure Partnerships Australia has referred to it, CEDA, if you can adopt my paper as being a publication of CEDA, have referred to it, and all of them were in support of it. And the community will like it, but what is the difficulty then? The problem is that, in my view, government actually doesn't like this concept of, let's give it a name, hypothecation. Hypothecation being where you link the tax, the payment, whatever, to a specific outcome. Now, governments don't like that because they actually want to collect the money, and then it's almost a trust us proposition that we will spend it in a way that will benefit the community. Now, the community is a bit suspicious of that, and that's why you find when you go to votes in the community and they can actually see that the payment is hypothecated to a particular use, you get support. And that's what really I would be pushing in respect of any investment in infrastructure now. There should be much greater attention to the prospect of hypothecation, to linking that use to payment, and then using that payment to fund the investments that you make. And that essentially is what we cover in our paper. We've just nibbled on one example. We looked at telecommunications as an example by way of analogy, because telecommunications is very much in the private sector these days, but it has very similar characteristics to most public infrastructure in that it's a monopoly asset. I mean, you don't see 2 roads built in parallel to each other competing with each other, for example. You don't see 2 rail networks built in parallel with each other competing with each other. They are monopoly assets and need to be dealt with as monopoly assets. But you can actually regulate them in a way that allows user payments to fund investment in that asset and a better outcome for the community. And we've demonstrated with the telecommunications model as touched on in my paper. And I just think we should be looking at that in a much more holistic way across the broader community. And that's really, why not? Would be the question I'd ask at the end of that. Thank you.